Everything you will hear in this video really happened. The events, locations, and crimes are real. Some parts may be dramatized, but their content is documented and verified. Some descriptions may be disturbing, as reality and death show no regard for sensitivities. Welcome to Hide the Evidence.
On March 17, 1976, as Dublin erupted in green-clad celebration and parade drums echoed through cobblestone streets, Sheila O'Hara brought her daughter into the world. The baby arrived on Ireland's most festive day, a date when the entire nation honored its patron saint with music, laughter, and pride. Sheila and Frank O'Hara named their daughter Elaine, cradling her tiny form as hospital windows framed the distant glow of festival lights. It seemed a blessing, this auspicious birthday, as though fate had marked their child for joy. Yet the promise of that March morning would prove cruelly deceptive. Elaine's childhood unfolded not in celebration but in shadow, her early years defined by a relentless cruelty that no child should endure. From her first days in primary school, other children sensed something different about her, something vulnerable, and they descended upon that vulnerability with the instinctive viciousness that young people sometimes possess. The bullying began subtly, whispers behind cupped hands, deliberate exclusions from playground games, lunch tables that suddenly filled when she approached. Then it intensified. Classmates mocked her appearance, her mannerisms, the way she spoke or moved. They invented cruel nicknames that followed her through hallways like chains. Teachers either failed to notice or chose not to intervene, leaving Elaine to navigate each school day as though walking through hostile territory without armor or allies. The psychological damage accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer, crushing her self-esteem beneath its weight. She began to internalize the messages her tormentors delivered so consistently, that she was worthless, unlovable, fundamentally defective in ways she could neither understand nor repair. Her reflection in mirrors became an enemy. Social situations transformed into minefields where every interaction might detonate into humiliation. She withdrew inward, building walls around her heart that kept out cruelty but also kept out light. Then, miraculously, one person broke through those walls. A girl at school, kind, genuine, unbothered by social hierarchies, saw past Elaine's defensive exterior and offered friendship without conditions. For the first time, Elaine experienced acceptance. They spent hours together, sharing secrets and laughter, creating memories that felt like proof that connection was possible, that perhaps she was not irredeemably broken after all. This friendship became Elaine's lifeline, the single thread tethering her to hope. The car accident happened without warning. One moment her friend existed in the world, vibrant and alive. The next, she was gone, erased by twisted metal and shattered glass on a rain-slicked Dublin road. Elaine received the news like a physical blow, her body folding inward as though trying to protect organs from impact. The funeral passed in a blur of tears and incomprehension. Grief consumed her, but beneath the grief lurked something more insidious, a whisper that perhaps she was cursed, that anyone who came close to her was doomed. The bullies had called her worthless. Now death itself seemed to confirm their verdict. Sheila O'Hara became her daughter's anchor in the storm. Where others had failed or abandoned Elaine, her mother remained constant, patient, loving, fiercely protective. Sheila recognized the depth of her daughter's pain and fought to help her navigate it. She sat with Elaine through the darkest hours, held her when sobs racked her thin frame, whispered reassurances that tomorrow might be gentler. Frank O'Hara loved his daughter too, but Sheila possessed an intuitive understanding of Elaine's suffering, a maternal connection that transcended words. For years, Sheila's presence kept Elaine tethered to life, even as depression's undertow pulled relentlessly downward. Then Sheila died. The loss detonated like a bomb in Elaine's psyche, obliterating whatever fragile stability she had constructed. Her mother, the one person who had never wavered, who had loved her unconditionally through every crisis, was gone. The date was August 22nd, 2002, and it marked the beginning of Elaine's descent into an abyss so deep that climbing out would seem impossible. Depression, which had shadowed her since childhood, now seized complete control. Suicidal thoughts transformed from occasional visitors into constant companions. She attempted to end her life repeatedly, each attempt a desperate bid to silence the unbearable pain screaming inside her skull. The psychiatric hospital admissions began. 14 times over the following years, Elaine would be admitted to psychiatric facilities, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes under section when professionals deemed her an imminent danger to herself. The hospitals became familiar territory, sterile corridors, medication schedules, group therapy sessions where she sat among others equally shattered. Frank O'Hara, devastated by his wife's death and terrified of losing his daughter, threw himself into securing the best possible care. He researched psychiatrists, demanded better treatment plans, refused to accept that his daughter was beyond help. Eventually, Frank found a renowned psychiatrist whose expertise and compassion seemed to reach Elaine when others could not. Under this doctor's care, something shifted. Medication combinations were adjusted. Therapeutic approaches evolved. Slowly, incrementally, Elaine began to stabilize. Hope, that most fragile of emotions, flickered back to life. She started believing that perhaps survival was possible, that the future might contain something beyond endless suffering. Then the psychiatrist died suddenly. The news arrived like a curse fulfilling its prophecy. Once again, someone who had helped her, who had seen value in her continued existence, had been taken away. The pattern seemed undeniable now. Everyone she loved, everyone who loved her, disappeared. Death followed her like a shadow, claiming those who came too close. The belief calcified into certainty. She was cursed, fundamentally unworthy of happiness, destined to lose anyone who mattered. The weight of this conviction settled over her like a burial shroud, heavy and suffocating, shaping every choice she would make in the years ahead. Despite everything, the psychiatric admissions, the suicide attempts, the crushing weight of depression that pressed down on her chest each morning, Elaine O'Hara refused to surrender completely. Something stubborn flickered inside her, a tiny flame that the darkness could diminish but never fully extinguish. She wanted what seemed so effortless for others, a normal life, meaningful work, perhaps even love. The path toward these ordinary dreams would be steep and treacherous, but she began climbing anyway, one faltering step at a time. Childcare became her refuge and purpose. Working part-time at a Dublin childcare center, Elaine discovered a version of herself she barely recognized. Capable, nurturing, genuinely needed. Children responded to her gentle manner with trust and affection, their small hands reaching for hers without hesitation or judgment. They did not see her psychiatric history or her scars, both visible and hidden. They saw only someone who listened patiently to their stories, who tied their shoelaces with care, who made them feel safe. In their presence, Elaine experienced something rare and precious. The sense that she had value, that her existence contributed something positive to the world. Determined to deepen her skills, she enrolled in evening Montessori teaching classes. After long days at the childcare center, she would drive through Dublin's evening traffic to sit in classrooms, taking notes on child development theories and educational philosophies. The coursework challenged her, but she persisted, motivated by a dream that had taken root despite all the trauma. Someday, she wanted to be a mother herself. The longing ran deep, almost primal. She imagined holding her own child, creating the kind of loving, stable home her mother had tried to provide. Motherhood represented redemption, proof that she could nurture life rather than be consumed by thoughts of death. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Matt Murphy, watched these efforts with cautious optimism. During their regular sessions, he noted Elaine's genuine determination to build a functional life, her commitment to work and study, her obvious gift for connecting with children. Yet he also recognized the fragility beneath these accomplishments. Her self-worth remained devastatingly low, her sense of deserving happiness almost non-existent. She spoke about herself with a harshness that made him wince, describing herself as fundamentally flawed, damaged beyond repair, unworthy of the good things others took for granted. He worked to challenge these distortions, but cognitive patterns carved by years of trauma proved resistant to change. Nevertheless, Elaine pushed forward with practical steps toward independence. She saved money from her part-time wages and purchased a small car, a modest vehicle that represented freedom and autonomy. No longer dependent on public transportation or others for rides, she could navigate Dublin on her own terms. Then came an even bigger milestone. She moved into her own apartment at Bellarmine Place. The flat was small, nothing luxurious, but it belonged to her alone. She arranged furniture, hung curtains, created a space that reflected her tentative hopes for the future. Her father Frank helped with the move, proud of his daughter's progress yet perpetually worried about her living alone, knowing how quickly her mental state could deteriorate. The apartment became both sanctuary and prison. On good days, it felt like evidence of her growing independence, a place where she could breathe without the institutional smell of hospitals or the weight of being constantly monitored. On bad days, the walls closed in, and the solitude amplified every dark thought until they echoed unbearably. She would sit on her small couch, staring at nothing, feeling the familiar pull of despair trying to drag her under. But she had her work to return to, children who expected her presence, routines that provided structure when her mind offered only chaos. Loneliness, however, gnawed at her constantly. She watched couples walking hand in hand through Dublin streets, observed families laughing together in cafes, and felt the ache of isolation intensify. Her dream of motherhood required a partner, someone who would love her enough to build a family together. Yet her history of bullying and rejection had left her convinced that conventional romance was impossible for someone like her. Who would want a woman with her psychiatric record, her scars, her brokenness? The question tormented her. Feeling slightly stronger than in previous years but still desperately lonely, Elaine decided to try online dating. The internet offered anonymity and distance, a way to connect without the immediate vulnerability of face-to-face rejection. But even as she considered this step, her damaged self-perception warped her choices in a tragic direction. Instead of mainstream dating platforms where people sought traditional relationships, she found herself drawn to alt.com, a website dedicated to BDSM, fetishes, and alternative sexual practices. Her attraction to this site did not stem from genuine interest in the lifestyle it represented. She had no deep-seated desire for dominance and submission dynamics, no authentic curiosity about bondage or pain as elements of consensual adult sexuality. Rather, her choice reflected something far darker, her absolute conviction that she was unworthy of normal love. She believed, with the certainty that years of trauma had instilled, that no one would want her as an equal partner, that conventional affection was beyond her reach. But perhaps, she reasoned with devastating logic, someone might want her as something less than equal. Perhaps in the world of dominance and submission, where power imbalances were explicit rather than hidden, she might find someone who would accept her despite her perceived worthlessness. This twisted reasoning led her to create a profile on alt.com, describing herself in terms that emphasized submission and availability. She browsed other profiles, reading descriptions of dominants seeking submissives, masters seeking slaves, people seeking arrangements that formalized inequality. The language felt foreign and uncomfortable, but she pushed through her discomfort, driven by loneliness and the desperate hope that someone, anyone, might want her in whatever capacity they would accept her. Then she received a message from a man whose profile suggested experience, confidence, and control. He presented himself as a dominant partner, someone who understood the lifestyle and could guide a submissive through its complexities. His messages were articulate, even charming in their way, and he seemed genuinely interested in her. They began exchanging communications through the site, then moved to text messages, building a connection that felt, to Elaine's starved heart, like attention and perhaps even affection. She did not know, could not know, that the man behind these messages was not seeking a consensual BDSM relationship. She could not see that he had identified her vulnerability with predatory precision, recognizing in her profile and messages exactly what he had been searching for. Someone isolated, damaged, convinced of her own worthlessness, desperate enough to accept treatment that others would immediately reject. She could not know that his interest in her had nothing to do with desire or even twisted affection, and everything to do with opportunity. The man's name was Graham Dwyer, and what began as an unconventional online connection would become the most dangerous relationship of Elaine O'Hara's life. A relationship that would exploit every vulnerability she possessed, manipulate every desperate hope she harbored, and ultimately lead her toward a fate more terrible than any of her darkest suicidal thoughts had ever imagined. Graham Dwyer lived the kind of life that inspired envy among those who valued conventional success. A qualified architect with a respected firm, he commanded a substantial salary designing buildings that would shape Dublin's skyline for decades. His professional reputation was impeccable. Colleagues described him as talented, detail-oriented, someone who delivered projects on time and exceeded client expectations. He wore expensive suits to the office, spoke confidently in meetings, and possessed the kind of easy charm that made clients trust him with multi-million euro developments. His business cards bore impressive credentials, and his portfolio showcased structures that blended aesthetic vision with practical functionality. Beyond the professional sphere, Graham had constructed an equally impressive personal life. He lived in Foxrock, one of Dublin's most affluent neighborhoods, where tree-lined streets wound past substantial homes occupied by doctors, lawyers, business executives, and other members of Ireland's upper-middle class. His house was spacious and well-maintained, the kind of property that signaled financial security and social standing. Inside, family photographs decorated walls and shelves, images of Graham with his wife, a professional woman who had built her own successful career, and their 2 children, who attended good schools and participated in the activities that privileged Dublin children enjoyed. To neighbors who waved as he departed for work each morning, Graham appeared to be exactly what he claimed. A devoted family man balancing career demands with domestic responsibilities. He attended school events for his children, hosted occasional dinner parties where conversation flowed over good wine, and maintained the lawn with suburban diligence. His wife trusted him, or at least had no obvious reason not to. His children knew him as the father who came home each evening, who helped with homework when his schedule allowed, who represented stability and provision. The mask he wore fit so perfectly that even those closest to him could not see the cracks. But behind the facade of respectability, behind the architect's blueprints and the family photographs, Graham Dwyer harbored fantasies that had nothing to do with consensual adult sexuality and everything to do with death. His private digital life revealed a consuming obsession with violence against women, particularly extreme violence that resulted in permanent injury or death. He collected and viewed images and videos depicting mutilated female bodies, women with severe injuries, crime scene photographs showing victims of brutal attacks. These were not fictional horror movie scenes or artistic representations. They were real suffering, real trauma, real death, and Graham consumed this content with an appetite that grew more insatiable over time. His fantasies extended beyond passive viewing. He imagined himself as the perpetrator, the one inflicting the injuries, the one watching life drain from a woman's eyes. He did not fantasize about consensual BDSM scenarios where partners negotiated boundaries and used safe words to ensure everyone's well-being. He fantasized about killing. The distinction was crucial. BDSM practitioners, even those who explored edge play and intense sensations, operated within frameworks of consent, communication, and mutual care. Graham's desires existed outside those frameworks entirely. He wanted not a willing partner but a victim, not negotiated scenes but actual murder. For years, these fantasies remained confined to his imagination and his secret digital consumption. He was intelligent enough to recognize that acting on such impulses would destroy everything he had built: his career, his family, his freedom. Yet the fantasies persisted and intensified, creating a pressure that demanded release. He needed an outlet, a way to move from imagination toward reality without immediately crossing the line into obvious criminality. He needed someone vulnerable enough to accept treatment that would horrify most people, someone isolated enough that her disappearance might be attributed to other causes, someone desperate enough to comply with increasingly dangerous demands. When Graham discovered Alt.com, he recognized it as a hunting ground. The website's purpose was legitimate, connecting adults interested in alternative sexual practices within consensual frameworks. But Graham understood that among the genuine practitioners were vulnerable people like Elaine O'Hara, individuals whose damaged self-worth made them susceptible to exploitation. He created a profile emphasizing dominance and control, using language borrowed from the BDSM community, but twisted toward his actual purposes. Then he began searching for the right victim. Elaine's profile revealed everything he needed to know. Her messages betrayed her desperation, her conviction that she deserved nothing better than whatever scraps of attention someone might offer. She had no experience with BDSM culture, no understanding of how healthy power exchange relationships actually functioned, no knowledge of the safety practices and community standards that protected participants. She was, in Graham's assessment, perfect. Their initial communications followed a pattern of grooming that predators have refined across centuries. Graham presented himself as experienced and knowledgeable, someone who could guide Elaine into this unfamiliar world. He was patient at first, building trust through attention and apparent interest in her life. He asked about her work with children, her studies, her dreams, gathering information that he would later weaponize against her. He introduced concepts gradually: dominance and submission, master and slave. The idea that she should surrender control to someone who knew better than she did what she needed. Elaine, starved for connection and convinced of her own unworthiness, interpreted his attention as a form of caring. When he suggested they meet in person, she agreed despite her nervousness. That first encounter established the template for everything that followed. Graham positioned himself as master, insisting she address him with that title and refer to herself as his slave. The terminology was borrowed from BDSM culture, but the reality bore no resemblance to consensual power exchange. There were no negotiations about boundaries, no discussions of limits, no safe words that would stop activities if they became too intense. There was only Graham's will and Elaine's compliance. To maintain secrecy and avoid leaving traces that might connect him to Elaine, Graham insisted they communicate primarily through prepaid mobile phones. Burner phones purchased with cash, untraceable to his real identity. He never saved his actual name in her phone, instead appearing as master or similar coded terms. He instructed her never to contact him except through these designated channels, never to approach him if she happened to see him in public, never to tell anyone about their relationship. The secrecy served his purposes perfectly. It isolated Elaine further while protecting his respectable public identity. Their encounters escalated with calculated deliberation. What began as bondage, tying her wrists, restricting her movement, progressed to beatings that left bruises across her body. Graham watched her reactions carefully, testing how much pain she would endure, how far he could push before she resisted. When she accepted the beatings without fleeing, he introduced cutting. Using a thin-bladed knife, he would slice into her skin, watching blood well up and flow, observing her face as she experienced the sensation. He recorded these sessions on his phone, creating a video library of her suffering that he could review later, alone, feeding his fantasies. The text messages between them revealed the true nature of their dynamic. Graham would send messages describing future punishments, forcing Elaine to contemplate what awaited her at their next meeting. Sometimes he would present her with choices. Would she prefer to be beaten, stabbed, or hung? The questions were sadistic psychological torture, forcing her to participate in planning her own suffering. When she begged him to decide because she could not bear choosing, he would mock her weakness or punish her for failing to obey his command to choose. Elaine occasionally tried to assert boundaries or express fear, but Graham had studied her vulnerabilities too well. He knew exactly which psychological buttons to push to bring her back into compliance. He exploited her desperate desire for motherhood, her terror of abandonment, her suicidal ideation. Every weakness became a tool for manipulation. And beneath all his actions lay his ultimate goal, the fantasy he was methodically working toward. Not just hurting Elaine, but killing her. Graham Dwyer was not a dominant partner in any legitimate sense. He was a predator who had found the perfect victim, a man whose respectable facade concealed a murderous obsession, an architect who was carefully constructing not buildings but the conditions for getting away with murder. And Elaine, desperate and damaged, could not see the trap closing around her until it was far too late. The digital trail Graham Dwyer and Elaine O'Hara created over their years of contact would eventually become the most damning evidence against him. A chronicle of psychological manipulation, so methodical and cruel that reading through the messages felt like watching a slow-motion murder. More than 800 text messages passed between their burner phones, and countless others through various channels, each one a breadcrumb marking Elaine's path deeper into Graham's trap. The messages revealed a pattern that contradicted any notion of consensual adult relationship. A woman who periodically recognized danger and tried to escape, and a man who deployed calculated psychological warfare to drag her back each time. Elaine's attempts to establish boundaries appeared sporadically throughout their correspondence. Moments of clarity when some part of her recognized that what was happening to her was wrong. She would send messages saying she needed space, that the relationship frightened her, that she wanted to stop meeting him. These assertions of self-preservation were tentative and apologetic, reflecting her damaged self-worth even as she tried to protect herself. She would write that she could not continue, that the pain was too much, that she needed to focus on her mental health and her work with children. For brief periods, she would stop responding to his messages, creating silence that might have led to safety if Graham had accepted her withdrawal. But Graham never accepted her attempts to leave. Each time Elaine tried to establish distance, he would wait, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, allowing her to believe she had successfully escaped. Then he would reappear with messages carefully crafted to exploit her specific vulnerabilities. He would express concern about her well-being, ask how she was managing, remind her that he understood her in ways no one else could. He would alternate between reassurance and subtle threat, between promises and punishments, between affection and coldness, keeping her perpetually off balance and unable to develop the resolve necessary for permanent separation. The most significant break in their contact occurred in 2009, when Elaine managed to maintain distance for an extended period. For months, she did not respond to Graham's messages, and the silence suggested she might finally have broken free from his control. She focused on her work, attended her psychiatric appointments with Dr. Murphy, and tried to rebuild the fragile stability that her involvement with Graham had shattered. Perhaps she had found the strength to recognize that whatever Graham offered, attention, structure, the illusion of being wanted, came at a price too terrible to continue paying. But in 2011, Graham reappeared, and this time he deployed the most devastating weapon in his psychological arsenal, Elaine's desperate dream of motherhood. He knew from their earlier conversations, and from the personal information she had shared during vulnerable moments, that having a child represented her deepest longing, the one thing that might redeem her painful existence and prove she was capable of creating rather than destroying. He understood that this dream haunted her, that she watched mothers with their children at the childcare center, where she worked and felt an ache so profound it bordered on physical pain. Graham's messages began promising what Elaine wanted most in the world. If she came back to him, if she obeyed him completely and without question, he would get her pregnant. He would give her the child she craved, the baby who would love her unconditionally and provide the purpose her life lacked. He painted pictures with his words, Elaine holding an infant, finally becoming the mother she was meant to be, finding redemption through motherhood. The promises were lies, calculated manipulations from a married man who had no intention of fathering a child with her. But Elaine wanted to believe them so desperately that she allowed hope to override reason. The cruelty of this manipulation cannot be overstated. Graham identified the one thing that might make Elaine's suffering feel worthwhile and dangled it before her like bait, knowing she would return to him despite every warning her instincts provided. He framed his offer as conditional. She must prove herself worthy through absolute obedience, must accept whatever he demanded without resistance, must surrender completely to his control. Only then, he suggested, would he reward her with pregnancy and the relationship she craved. The promise transformed their dynamic from something Elaine might eventually escape into something she felt compelled to endure, because walking away would mean abandoning her last hope of achieving her dream. Simultaneously, Graham exploited Elaine's suicidal ideation with equally calculated malice. He knew from her psychiatric history and her own admissions that she struggled constantly with thoughts of ending her life, that depression whispered to her daily about the relief death might bring. During her darkest moments, when she sent him messages describing her despair and her desire to stop existing, Graham would respond not with concern or encouragement to seek help, but with an offer that revealed his true intentions. He could give her peace by killing her quickly. He framed murder as mercy, suggesting that if she truly wanted to die, he could provide a faster, more certain method than her previous suicide attempts. He described scenarios where he would end her life, presenting them as acts of compassion rather than violence, as though he would be doing her a favor by strangling or stabbing her. The messages were chilling in their coldness, devoid of any genuine care for her well-being, focused entirely on normalizing the idea of her death at his hands. He was conditioning her to accept murder as inevitable, even desirable, preparing her psychologically for the moment when he would act on his fantasies. Graham's instructions about secrecy grew more elaborate and insistent over time. He ordered Elaine never to save his real name in her phone, to delete messages after reading them, to tell no one about their relationship. He specified exactly how she should refer to him in any written communication: never Graham, never his surname, only master or coded terms that would not identify him if discovered. He controlled when and where they met, always choosing locations that minimized the risk of witnesses who might later connect him to her. This enforced secrecy served multiple purposes. It protected Graham's respectable public identity, ensuring that his wife, children, colleagues, and neighbors remained ignorant of his double life. It isolated Elaine further, preventing her from developing any support system that might intervene or help her recognize the danger she faced. It also established his complete dominance over the relationship's terms, making clear that everything occurred according to his rules and his timeline, that she had no agency beyond the choice to comply or be abandoned. The messages revealed Elaine's increasing fear as Graham's demands escalated. She would text him before their meetings expressing terror about going to isolated locations, begging him to meet somewhere safer, somewhere public, somewhere she might have escaped roots if needed. She wrote that she was frightened of the woods, of remote areas where no one could hear her scream, of situations where she would be completely at his mercy. Her messages pleaded for reassurance, for modifications to his plans, for any concession that might reduce her vulnerability. Graham's responses to her fear were dismissive and manipulative. He would mock her for being weak, accuse her of failing to trust him, threaten to end their relationship if she did not obey without question. He reminded her that slaves do not negotiate with masters, that her role required absolute submission regardless of her comfort or safety. When she persisted in expressing fear, he would sometimes offer false reassurance, promising he would not hurt her badly, claiming he only wanted to push her boundaries, insisting that her fear was irrational because he cared about her. These reassurances were lies designed to secure her compliance, and they worked because Elaine desperately wanted to believe that someone cared about her, even someone who hurt her. The pattern of coercion documented in their messages showed Graham methodically preparing Elaine for murder. He introduced increasingly violent scenarios in his texts, describing in detail what he might do to her during future sessions. He sent messages about stabbing her, about watching her bleed, about how it would feel to take her life. He forced her to respond to these messages, to acknowledge that she had read and understood what he planned, creating a record of her apparent consent to activities that were actually preparations for homicide. He also used their text exchanges to gather information about her schedule, her movements, her vulnerabilities. He would ask when she had appointments with Dr. Murphy, when she worked at the childcare center, when her father might expect to hear from her. He inquired about her medications, her current mental state, whether she was feeling particularly suicidal on any given day. Each piece of information helped him construct a plan for killing her in a way that might be attributed to suicide rather than murder. The messages documented Graham's manipulation of Elaine's hope and despair like a textbook case of predatory grooming. When she was feeling slightly stronger or more hopeful, he would remind her of his promise to get her pregnant, dangling the possibility of motherhood to keep her engaged. When she was feeling suicidal and worthless, he would suggest that death at his hands might be preferable to continued suffering, normalizing murder as a reasonable option. He kept her perpetually off balance, never allowing her to develop the clarity or strength necessary to permanently escape his control. Throughout their correspondence, Elaine's personality emerged as fundamentally decent despite her damage. She asked about his children, expressed concern when he mentioned work stress, tried to be supportive even as he exploited her. She apologized constantly for disappointing him, for being afraid, for failing to be the perfect slave he demanded. Her messages revealed someone desperate to please, to be worthy of love, to finally be enough for someone. The tragedy was that her efforts to please Graham only made her more vulnerable to his manipulation, because he had no interest in her as a person and every interest in her as a victim. Graham's messages, by contrast, revealed a man utterly devoid of genuine empathy. His expressions of affection were transparently manipulative, deployed strategically to maintain control rather than reflecting authentic emotion. His promises were lies designed to secure compliance. His interest in Elaine's well-being extended only to ensuring she remained accessible for his use. He was not a dominant partner in any legitimate sense, but a predator systematically grooming his prey, and every message he sent moved Elaine closer to the fate he had been planning since their first encounter. The digital record they created would eventually expose the truth that Graham had tried so carefully to conceal. This was not a consensual BDSM relationship between adults exploring alternative sexuality, but a prolonged campaign of psychological manipulation designed to prepare a vulnerable woman for murder. The messages showed a pattern of coercion, control, and escalating violence that built methodically toward a single, inevitable conclusion. Graham Dwyer was not helping Elaine explore her sexuality or fulfill her fantasies. He was grooming her for death, and the 800 text messages between them documented every calculated step of that grooming process, creating evidence that would ultimately help ensure he faced justice for what he had been planning all along. The morning of August 22, 2012, arrived with the weight of anniversary grief pressing down on Elaine O'Hara before she even opened her eyes. 10 years had passed since her mother's death, a full decade since the loss that had shattered her world and sent her spiraling into the darkness from which she had never fully emerged. Each year on this date, the pain felt fresh despite the passage of time, as though the wound refused to heal and instead remained perpetually raw, bleeding invisibly beneath the surface of her daily functioning. Elaine rose from her bed at Bellarmine Place and moved through her morning routine with the mechanical movements of someone whose mind was elsewhere, lost in memories of her mother's face, her voice, the safety she had represented. She dressed simply, choosing clothes appropriate for a cemetery visit, and gathered the items she would need for her annual pilgrimage. Her handbag sat on the kitchen counter, containing her iPhone, identification documents, and the everyday necessities that anchored her to normal life. She glanced at these items, then left them behind, taking only what she had been instructed to bring. The instructions had arrived via text message on the burner phone Graham had given her, the slave phone that connected her to him and only him. His messages had been explicit and detailed, leaving no room for misinterpretation or deviation. She was to come without her personal phone, wearing no underwear beneath her clothes, her body shaved as he preferred, bringing only the prepaid phone so he could contact her without any possibility of the communication being traced to his real identity. The instructions felt wrong, especially on this day of all days, but she had learned through painful experience that disobeying Graham brought consequences she could not bear. Before leaving her apartment, Elaine took one last look around the small space that represented her hard-won independence. Everything was in its place, her handbag on the counter, her iPhone charging beside it, documents and personal items arranged with the care of someone who valued order in a life that often felt chaotic. She did not know, could not know, that she would never return to this apartment, that the items she left behind would become evidence in an investigation, that her father and investigators would soon stand in this exact spot, trying to understand what had happened to her. The drive to Shankle Cemetery followed a route she had traveled many times before, the roads familiar from previous anniversary visits. Her small Fiat Punto navigated through Dublin traffic as morning gave way to late afternoon, carrying her toward the place where her mother rested. She parked at the cemetery gates, the car fitting into a space that would later be noted by witnesses, its presence becoming a crucial piece of the puzzle investigators would struggle to solve. Elaine walked through the cemetery gates and made her way along paths she knew by heart, past rows of headstones marking other families' losses, until she reached her mother's grave. She stood before the stone that bore her mother's name and dates, and the grief that had been building all morning finally broke through whatever barriers she had constructed to contain it. Witnesses who happened to be visiting their own loved ones' graves noticed her crying, a woman alone and clearly devastated, but they thought nothing of it beyond natural sympathy. Grief in cemeteries was expected, unremarkable, and they could not have known that this woman's tears carried layers of meaning beyond simple mourning. She cried for her mother, for the 10 years that had passed without her guidance and unconditional love. She cried for herself, for the broken life she had been living, for the psychiatric hospitals and suicide attempts, and the crushing loneliness that never fully released its grip. She cried for the dream of motherhood that seemed perpetually out of reach, for the hope that Graham had dangled before her like salvation. She cried because this anniversary always stripped away whatever defenses she had managed to build throughout the year, leaving her raw and vulnerable and desperate. What the witnesses could not see, what no one could have guessed, was that Dwyer had chosen this day with deliberate calculation. He understood that anniversaries of traumatic loss created emotional vulnerability, that grief opened wounds and weakened psychological defenses. He knew Elaine would be at her most fragile on August 22nd, her judgment impaired by sorrow, her resistance diminished by the weight of remembering. He had selected this date not despite its significance, but because of it, recognizing that a woman drowning in anniversary grief would be least able to protect herself, most likely to comply with dangerous instructions, most vulnerable to whatever he had planned. After her time at her mother's graveside, Elaine checked the burner phone and found additional instructions from Graham. He directed her to walk beyond the cemetery proper, into a more isolated area near Killikee, where woods and remote terrain offered privacy from witnesses and escape routes. The location was deliberately chosen for its isolation, far from the populated areas where someone might intervene or later remember seeing them together. Elaine's terror manifested in the text messages she sent Graham as she contemplated following his instructions. Her fingers trembled as she typed, expressing fear about going somewhere so remote, begging him to reconsider, pleading with him to meet at her apartment instead where she would feel safer. She wrote that she was frightened, that the isolation scared her, that surely they could meet somewhere less isolated. Her messages carried the desperation of someone who sensed danger but felt powerless to refuse, trapped between her fear of what might happen if she went and her fear of what would happen if she disobeyed. Graham's responses dismissed her concerns with the cold efficiency he had perfected over their years of contact. He reminded her that slaves do not question masters, that her role required obedience regardless of her comfort, that if she truly wanted the pregnancy he had promised, she needed to prove her submission by following his instructions without resistance. He deployed the psychological weapons he had been sharpening since their first contact. Her desperate hope for motherhood, her terror of abandonment, her conviction that she deserved nothing better than whatever treatment he chose to give her. Despite every instinct screaming warnings, despite the fear that made her hands shake and her breath come short, Elaine complied. She walked beyond the cemetery gates, past the last of the maintained grounds, into the isolated wooded area where Graham had instructed her to go. She walked toward a meeting that she feared but could not refuse, driven by the toxic combination of hope and despair that Graham had so carefully cultivated. She walked toward the man who had been planning her murder since the day they met, the man who had groomed her methodically for this exact moment, the man who had chosen this emotionally devastating anniversary because it made her most vulnerable to his final manipulation. After that meeting, Elaine O'Hara vanished completely from the world she had been trying so hard to navigate. Her family's first indication that something was wrong came when they could not reach her by phone. They called repeatedly, and the phone rang but went unanswered, the sound echoing in empty space, connecting to no one. Frank O'Hara, already anxious about his daughter on this difficult anniversary, felt his worry escalate into alarm as hours passed without contact. When Frank and other family members used their spare key to enter Elaine's apartment at Bellarmine Place, they found a scene that made no sense in the context of suicide, which was their first terrible fear given her history. Her handbag sat exactly where she had left it on the kitchen counter, her iPhone beside it, still charging. Her identification documents, bank cards, and all the personal items she would need for any extended absence remained in the apartment. The bed was made, dishes were clean, everything was orderly and in place. It looked as though she had simply stepped out briefly and would return at any moment, except she did not return. The discovery of her Fiat Punto parked at Shankill Cemetery gates provided a logical explanation for her absence. She had gone to visit her mother's grave on the anniversary, a pilgrimage everyone knew she made faithfully each year. But where had she gone after the cemetery visit? Why had she left her car there? Why was she not answering her phone? The questions multiplied without producing answers, and the family's confusion deepened into genuine fear as more time passed without any word from Elaine. The Gardaí were contacted, and officers began the initial investigation into Elaine's disappearance. Given her well-documented history of severe depression, multiple psychiatric hospital admissions, and previous suicide attempts, both the family and the investigating officers initially leaned toward the theory that she had taken her own life. The anniversary of her mother's death provided a logical trigger, and her emotional state at the cemetery, witnessed crying at the graveside, seemed to support this interpretation. Perhaps the grief had become unbearable, and she had walked from the cemetery into some isolated location to end her suffering. Yet certain details troubled those who knew Elaine best. Every previous suicide attempt had occurred at her apartment, in the familiar space where she felt most comfortable confronting her darkest impulses. She had never disappeared before, never vanished into thin air, leaving her car abandoned and her phone unanswered. The pattern felt wrong somehow, inconsistent with her previous behavior even in her most desperate moments. The search of her apartment yielded an unexpected and shocking discovery that further complicated the investigation. Hidden away, not immediately visible but found during thorough examination of her belongings, was a collection of BDSM equipment. Ropes, restraints, whips, bondage gear, items that seemed utterly inconsistent with the quiet, gentle woman who worked with children and dreamed of becoming a mother. Family members reacted with confusion and embarrassment, unable to reconcile this discovery with the Elaine they thought they knew. Investigators noted the items but treated them as an embarrassing personal detail rather than a vital clue, a private aspect of her life that seemed unrelated to her disappearance. No one connected the BDSM equipment to the possibility that Elaine might have been involved with someone dangerous, someone who had exploited her vulnerabilities and groomed her for violence. No one thought to search for a partner who might have information about her whereabouts. The gear was simply catalogued and set aside, dismissed as irrelevant to the central question of whether she had committed suicide or met with some other fate. As days turned into weeks without any sign of Elaine, no body discovered, no further communication, no activity on her bank accounts or phone, the case grew cold. The investigation continued in a desultory fashion, but without new leads or evidence, there was little investigators could do beyond wait and hope that something would surface. The prevailing theory remained suicide, with her body presumably hidden somewhere in the vast areas of wilderness surrounding Dublin, waiting to be discovered by chance. Frank O'Hara and the rest of Elaine's family entered a special kind of hell reserved for those whose loved ones disappear without explanation. They could not properly grieve because they had no confirmation of death, could not move forward because hope refused to die completely, could not find peace because every day brought the same unanswered questions. They existed in agonizing limbo, suspended between hope and despair, waiting for news that might never come. And Graham Dwyer returned to his life in Foxrock, to his wife and children, to his architectural firm and his respectable facade, believing he had committed the perfect crime. He had killed Elaine on a day when her emotional vulnerability was at its peak, in a location isolated enough to avoid witnesses, and he had groomed her so thoroughly that even the discovery of BDSM equipment in her apartment did not raise suspicions about a dangerous partner. He had exploited her suicidal history to create a ready-made explanation for her disappearance. He had used burner phones and careful operational security to avoid leaving traces connecting him to her. He had, he believed, gotten away with murder, and as the investigation stalled and months passed without breakthrough, that belief seemed entirely justified.